Shemai, and welcome to the Senedd Explains podcast. Here, we'll be extending the work we already do through our social media and Substack into podcast form, bringing Welsh politics closer to you by breaking down everything that's happening in Cardiff Bay and beyond. I'm Gwion, a student from Caerphilly at the University of Glasgow, and the seismic by-election results will be the main focus of our podcast today.
And I'm Manon. I'm originally from Cardiff, but I live in London now, and I look after Senedd Explains Substack.
And this podcast has only been made possible by Be The Change Network, who are very kindly hosting the Senedd Explains podcast. They seek to give young people a voice on any issue they're passionate about, not simply in politics, through the medium of podcasting. You can check out the network's podcasts and more about their mission in the description below. And we'd like to thank Lily and Be The Change Network for all the support in setting up this podcast. So we're recording this on Sunday the 26th of October. Plaid Cymru have achieved a seismic win in the Caerphilly by-election with 47.4% of the vote, with Reform falling behind to 36%, far behind the win that was largely expected of them, and the Labour vote absolutely collapsing to 11%, a loss of over 30 percentage points. Manon, what's your reaction to this?
Well, do you know what's really funny? So I think we should tell people that we did a trial run of this podcast to test out, the audio and all that stuff. So we did a trial run before the by-election, and I was listening back to it, and I start off by saying the Camlas poll had come out, and I was saying I felt a bit stupid or a bit silly maybe, because I don't know why, but part of me just I knew that Reform were going to perform really well and were going to be a strong force to be reckoned with, but I don't know why. I just thought Plaid would take it. And then by the time we were doing that trial run and talking through it and looking at the poll, obviously I'd had my mind changed completely. And then vindication, there was a reason I thought for some reason Plaid would be able to take it, because they did, and they didn't just pip them to the post. They really ran away with it. So even though I'm saying that I kind of part of me thought ahead of time that they would manage to do this, I will say that on the night I was gobsmacked. I was scrolling through Twitter and everything I possibly could, obviously Senedd Explains Instagram, watching this unfold, and I was just baffled. I mean, I think there's a lot to say about what happens now going forward for Plaid and Reform. There's so much analysis to do, but I think the big point is that this is a huge victory for Plaid. Even if it comes with its challenges, they're going to be absolutely over the moon with this, and Reform are going to be, I don't want to swear, but really, really annoyed about this. How does it feel as a Caerphilly resident, Gwion?
Well, I was astounded, if I'm honest. I think many of us in Caerphilly and beyond thought that this would be a Reform win. The one poll that we had, which was a Camlas Observation poll, showed a slight but, lead by Reform over Plaid Cymru. And I don't think anyone expected a margin this large. If we look at the margin, it's 3,800 votes, which is a lead of 11%. And Plaid Cymru's majority is more than the entire Labour vote. And when we put it into perspective, I think it shows just how monumental of a win and a boost this is for Plaid Cymru now going into the next election on the 7th of May. Now, as a Caerphilly resident, it was a very, very contentious election, I think, in very sad circumstances after the death of Hefin David. But also the campaign was marketed by both Plaid and Labour as being a two-horse race between either of them and Reform. And I think this argument has now been won by Plaid Cymru, and I think going certainly into the next election, it will be very easy for Plaid Cymru to make that argument. But now we have Lindsay Whittle as our MS. He was sworn in on Friday, of course, and he's now had to resign as a councillor because he feels that he won't be able to commit to the council as much as he has over the past 50 years. But for what it's worth, Lindsay Whittle will be a very hard-working MS for Caerphilly. He always has been as a councillor for the past 50 years. And never mind your politics, I think one thing that can be said about Lindsay Whittle is that he is very well known in the local community because he is hard-working, not just for the past 14 elections that he's contested, and this was the 14th and he was successful at, but also in between and before that as well. So I think this is a huge political earthquake in Caerphilly, but for actual political representation, Lindsay Whittle as an individual will be an extremely hard-working one, and an MS I think everybody will be able to count on, no matter who they voted for.
I think it's really interesting you saying no matter your politics. I think we can, it's clear that when Lindsay Whittle is committed to the area and to working hard for the people. And I think I mentioned this in the article too, but Politics Joe conducted some really excellent interviews with Caerphilly residents, asking who they voted for, who they planned on voting for. And this one woman, she's asked who she votes for, and she said, I'm going to vote for Lindsay Whittle. And it's, I mean, I don't know if she's a historic Plaid voter, but all I know is that her justification for her vote was, I know him and I like him. And that's it. She sees him around. He's been there. He's been working in Caerphilly for 50 years. She likes him. She thinks he does good for the community. And I think, thing is, I would like to talk about candidates because I think it's a really important part of Reform's loss. But I think Keir versus Lindsay wasn't the battle here. It was, either you want reform or you want to stop reform, and that's why it became a two-horse race between them. But I do think that the nature of the candidates will have sort of helped make that gap between Plaid and Reform's vote a bit bigger, because Plaid were fortunate to have a candidate who is well known, is well liked, has done a lot for the area. And Reform, and this is the point I wanted to make about candidates, Reform have been getting away with not having any this whole time. And they're not concerned about it. It's like all part of the plan. They were starting their vetting process, their application process much later. They were very open about this. They didn't feel they needed them. And they didn't, because ahead of this whole by-election, we were doing, Senev polls coming out for next year anyway. And Reform's vote was just growing and growing and growing. And we're watching this thing, they're not even doing anything. They've not announced any Welsh policies. They don't have a Welsh leader. They haven't announced any candidates. This is just happening organically. And so, why would they need candidates and policies? Because all that's going to do is perhaps, like when Laura Ann Jones defected, actually, that made things slightly worse because people were annoyed that it was ex-Tories now representing Reform. So they were getting away with not having these people. And then the by-election forces them to put someone out there. And I can't speak on this definitely, but I don't think Cleve Powell wanted to run. I don't think it was part of the plan. I think he was really content being the comms man, working behind the scenes, kind of being the puppet master, and then they had to put him forward. And that wasn't good enough. And when you're standing against a man like Lindsay Whittle, who the people of Caerphilly really love, obviously, it meant that, the gap between the two of them and what it felt like the parties cared about the area and who they were willing to put forward, I think that definitely pushed the gap between the votes.
And it was absolutely a good result for Reform regardless. They won 36% of the vote, and in next year's election, which will be under the Dehont system, and for those who listening who don't know what the Dehont system is, it's a form of proportional representation, and that means that there will be 96 seats at the Senev next year after the election, and there will be 16 jumbo constituencies or mega constituencies, which will elect 6 members each. And as a general rule, for every 12% each party gets in each jumbo constituency, they will earn 1 seat. Now, as things stand, that would mean 3 seats for Reform and 3 seats for Plaid Cymru in their seats. Now, this comes with a lot of caveats because you cannot directly translate a first-past-the-post by-election to the Dehont system next year on a far larger seat, of course. But what it does tell us is that if this result was to be replicated, Labour would be in the territory of not getting a seat at all in their stronghold, which would be disastrous for Labour, and it would certainly, mark perhaps the beginning of the end for Welsh Labour, a 2015 Scottish Labour style wipeout. And I think it really begs the question then, what does Labour stand for? Because I'm not sure their pitch going into this by-election was entirely clear at all. Richard Tunnicliffe, not a seasoned politician at all, a local businessman who ran a children's books publishing company, didn't exactly have the flair that other local politicians might have. But even then, the policies that they were pumping out, their pitch wasn't coherent, it wasn't clear. I don't think the arguments that they were making, that they'd had materially improved people's lives, was being made. And I think that was one of the reasons why people were turning away from them. They have not made people feel like their lives have materially improved. And I think, going to the next election, we had Owain Williams today in the Times writing an article essentially arguing this and arguing that they had to take a harder line against the UK government. And he's absolutely right. I don't think Labour can sit on their hands and shout partnership and power, because I think that has to materially mean things to people's lives. And it is going to be difficult, not least for the Welsh Labour Parliamentary Party, but it is going to mean having to go against the UK government, especially when their interests are at odds with Wales's.
Yeah, I also want to touch on you saying that their campaign ahead of this by-election just didn't kind of materialise as it should have. I'm quite baffled by the line that they did take, and I'm confused why they did take it, which is, as you mentioned earlier, both Plaid and Labour were saying, if you want to stop reform, vote us. And Plaid making that argument is viable, because if you look at the polls, that's who you're going to have to back. Labour knew that wasn't going to be the case. From every poll, everything we've seen, they knew that wasn't true, and so did everyone watching these videos of them saying, if you want to stop reform, you've got to mobilise behind us. It's just like, your candidates don't believe this themselves. And I think it's extra odd because we were at the Labour Party conference, and Eluned Morgan and Hiranka Davis and all these senior Welsh Labour politicians were really pushing the idea of, we know we are the underdog. We've seen the polls, they're really bad and it's not good, and we've got to get back up there to the high numbers, and we don't mind being the underdog. We're ready for a fight. We're prepared for a fight. But then if you're going to take that line and then in the by-election campaign not say, we know we're the underdogs, we know that we're polling badly, but come on, this is what we've done for you, get back behind us, to take the line of, no, we could beat reform here. It's just, none of it's coherent, and I don't understand why they went for that campaign, because it just makes them look a bit ridiculous, because every point they're pushing out is totally unbelievable. And yeah, I know also Will Hayward has been quite critical of the style of their campaigning and the kind of cringy meme culture. It was super cringe, but I think my concern was more with, it just felt like they were hallucinating.
Absolutely,
arguing that they would viably beat reform. I don't understand.
I think we do have to pick up on the point that Welsh Labour had tweeted what I can only describe as brain rot memes on the morning of the by-election, which can't objectively be funny, can't appeal to young people, but if you are the governing party of over 27 years and have ruled the roost in that seat for over 100 years and are about to lose it, you do not tweet that sort of thing on the morning of a by-election. I think this is why they're so falling behind in the polls, and I think we're beginning to see the death of Welsh Labour, is that they are lost. They have no idea what they are doing. They're giving the impression and the image that they are hapless, that they have no policy direction, that their communications over this by-election have been poor, and that's been kind. And their message simply has not been coherent as well. So I think Labour have a lot of soul-searching to do. On Friday, the Senedd group had a meeting to discuss the steps forward, and I think, they do need to be answering the question, one, what have they done to materially improve people's lives? And two, what is Labour for that is radically different, that people didn't feel like they could vote for them before? And if they can't answer those two basic intellectual questions, well, it's no surprise that they're projected to lose the next Senedd election.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I don't know if I can bring myself to believe that this is going to be the death of Welsh Labour long term. It's going to be disastrous. Next year, it's going to be terrible. I think we spoke about this before, but it's not going to be as bad as Caerphilly because the stakes are completely different.
Yes.
So
there was
people
certainly
who would have liked to vote Welsh
voting.
Labour, but were just thinking, oh God, we can't have reform, and knew that they would have to back Plaid Cymru in order to stop them in a win-lose situation, will have voted for Plaid, but will probably want to vote for Labour next year if that's where their loyalties lie, because it's different stakes and they may well get one member and they just want to express themselves. I think it's also worth talking about the Greens, because we were talking ahead of the election. We were talking a lot about the surge in members for the Greens, which is kind of the biggest news story in English politics at the moment. But it's really interesting, the Greens in Wales, because you can never quite tell whether it's going to translate over here. I don't doubt that a lot of people are joining the Greens from Wales or are feeling happy about what's happening. But I think since we have Plaid Cymru as this left-wing alternative already, and they already have a much bigger presence, it's going to be hard for the Greens to make a hit. We were thinking, will the Green surge affect the Caerphilly by-election? Will Plaid be suffering because people will choose to vote for the Greens? And we kind of thought, I don't think they will, because again, they'll know that they need to mobilise if they want to stop reform. And indeed, that did happen. I think they got something like 1.5% of the vote. I don't know if by next year, Polanski will be really eyeing up the Senedd elections and trying to get Green MSs into the Senedd. I don't know whether that's going to work. I don't know what you think about this, Gwion, whether they're going to be able to translate that power over into Wales.
I think the Polanski surge in England has been really interesting, and Wales as well to a lesser extent, but it's been happening primarily in England. They achieved 1.5% in the by-election in Caerphilly, which was their lowest ever result actually in the history of Senedd elections. A bit unsurprising. I have no doubt that not only were there people defecting from Labour to vote for Plaid Cymru, but also from the Greens as well. Not that the Greens have ever been particularly strong in Caerphilly. But I think going into the Senedd election next year, I think it has to be agreed very early on between the Green Party and Plaid Cymru what the strategy is. Because you don't want to achieve a split or to risk a split of left votes if you really want to have this chance of beating reform. And as mentioned before, in the Dehon system, every percentage counts, because for every 12% or around 12-13% that a party achieves, you win another seat in the Senedd. So if the left you want to unite, I think Polanski, who's now come out in favour of Welsh and Scottish independence, of course, has to spell out his strategy for the Senedd election. Will that mean an electoral pact with Plaid Cymru? Perhaps so, but these things need to be organised sooner rather than later. Otherwise, we'll see the debacle that is currently happening here in Scotland between the Scottish Greens and your party, which will ultimately, I think, see both parties lose out rather than unite and win and try to beat the surge of reform.
I do have faith in Polanski as someone who's going to be sort of rational and open in working out how they're going to approach the Senedd elections. Because I think it's interesting in all these graphics that are being posted by the Greens at the moment to celebrate the ever-growing milestones of members. I think they surpassed the Conservatives a few days ago, 140,000 members.
Yep, absolutely.
Anthony Slaughter is in those photos. He's right in the front with Zach Polanski. And I think 99.5% of the Welsh population would not be able to name Anthony Slaughter if they saw his face or know who he was. And maybe, the Welsh Greens, like we said, have never been particularly successful, so you wouldn't expect Anthony Slaughter to be a huge name. But Zach Polanski is clearly very committed to drawing in the Welsh Greens as, at the forefront of this general surge in Green voters. And I think especially in contrast to that catastrophic GB News interview this morning with Chris Philps, where he cannot even name Darren Miller, who is a much bigger personality in politics. Very humiliating for him. But also just really shows the difference in attitude between the traditional bigger parties and this new kind of green face that is being a lot more accepting and sort of supportive of Wales.
Yes, I think it's really interesting how Polanski came out in favour of Scottish and Welsh independence. I think it more or less makes Plaid Cymru and the Green Party almost identical in terms of policies. I think nuclear is the biggest thing they would disagree on. But I think these things need to be ironed out, like I said, because we're seeing rifts within the wider left here in Scotland because your party and the Scottish Greens cannot agree on what to do. And we're seeing defections at the minute from the Scottish Greens to your party, a party that legally doesn't exist or have any policies yet. So I think, like I said, these things need to be ironed out. I also think that the Welsh Greens need to up their comms game, I think. I'm not sure it's very clear who their leader is. Of course, they want to ride the Polanski surge, but you can't simultaneously argue that you're quite a distinct Welsh party if you're not putting your party leader out there as well. So I think they need to improve their communications game as well, in the same way that Plaid Cymru have excelled in this by-election and over the past year or so with their social media strategy. And you mentioned Darren Miller as well. He is someone who has been in the news not just because Chris Philp can't name him, even with 6 attempts, but he is also in negotiations at the minute with Eluned Morgan, the First Minister, for next year's budget. The Welsh Government's budget has to be agreed every year. It means being passed by the Senedd, and now that Plaid Cymru have won this by-election, Labour have lost their working majority. Now, this means that they require another party other than the Liberal Democrats to secure this budget. The first, and I think most essential point, is that if a budget is not agreed, it reverts to 75% of this year's budget, which, not even accounting for inflation, would be catastrophic for public services. We would see mass cuts in day-to-day spending in the NHS, in schools, and then even bigger than that, in the long term, we'd have to see less capital spending projects. That is, projects such as rail, construction of new schools and so forth. So it would be catastrophic for a budget not to be agreed for next year. And it's in no one's interest for that to happen. For what it's worth as well, it's possible for the Senedd to rectify this by passing more laws to amend the Wales Act. However, it is a perilous, perilous journey for Eluned Morgan now. She is negotiating with Darren Miller, who wants to achieve Kenny Badenoch's flagship abolish stamp duty policy by persuading Eluned Morgan to introduce it here in Wales in exchange for passing the budget. And for those who are listening and don't know what stamp duty is, it's a percentage-based tax on the value of a home when you are buying a property. It's got an exemption up to £225,000 for first-time buyers, but Darren Miller and Kenny Badenoch want to go even further, and they want to abolish this completely. And their proposition is that this would help solve the housing crisis. What do you make of this, Manon? A Welsh Labour, Welsh Conservative budget deal in the big 2025?
I know, who would have thought? I think it's slightly overstated, all these stories of being like, can you believe that Eluned Morgan, that Darren Miller proposed that they would be open to negotiations, and then Eluned Morgan said yes. And now they're in negotiations. Can you believe the Labour and the Conservatives? I mean, I think the bottom line is, and Darren Miller said this himself, this is a matter of we need to get this thing through, because as you said, if they don't, it's disastrous for the people of Wales, it's disastrous for public services. And so they're both kind of doing their duty as elected politicians who are representing the people of Wales to not let something that awful happen. And so they haven't said that, you know, they're becoming more politically aligned and this is why they're doing it. They're not doing it because they're trying to suck up to Welsh Labour. They're doing it because I think it's a perfectly respectable, goal to just get it passed, even if that means the Conservatives and the Labour Party collaborating. I think it's a perfectly respectable reason to enter negotiations, even if they're not politically aligned at all. I think it would be disastrous if they refuse to do it based on some kind of political higher than thou, holier than thou point of, oh no, well, we wouldn't negotiate with the Conservatives, or the Conservatives saying, no, we're not going to help you pass this budget because we don't cooperate with Welsh Labour. I think that would be totally futile, especially because they're both in such horrendous positions ahead of next year's elections. They might as well do this to get the budget passed.
I mean, I think it's a matter of pragmatism more than anything, and pragmatic politics. And like you said, it could work politically well for both of them, as they would be effectively prioritising public services over political allegiances. And as for the actual policy, I don't think it would be... I think it would be almost disingenuous for the Conservatives to be pushing this as a single sticking plaster to the housing crisis. The root of the housing crisis are far deeper. They're linked to house prices and the ratio of them to incomes in affordability, in housing quality. I think the issues of housing, of the housing crisis are far, far deeper than the amount of stamp duty, which, as I mentioned, is exempt for first-time buyers up to £225,000. So I think what we will see in these negotiations is a real push from the Conservatives to own this policy, but ultimately these issues run far, far deeper. Thank you very much for listening to the inaugural episode of the Senedd Explained podcast. I've been Gwion, and thank you ever so much for listening and supporting our work. And thanks again to Be The Change Podcast Network for helping us out with this podcast. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode.
And if there's anything you'd like to hear us talk about, please do let us know.
Diolch yn fawr.